war that God watched in silence. They called it a war for God, but the more they fought, the quieter heaven became. From Europe's cathedrals to Jerusalem's walls, kings marched believing paradise had a flag. They carried crosses and carved their prayers into steel. For 200 years, the world burned in the name of faith. Empires rose and fell. Children became soldiers. And the sound of prayer was drowned by the sound of war. But amid the chaos, one man changed everything. Not by conquering, but by forgiving. His name was Salah al-Din, the man the West would call Saladin. A warrior born in the dust of Tikrit, who rose not through bloodlust, but through mercy. He faced kings who came from across the sea, men who believed God himself had sent them. And yet, when the blades met, he fought with honor and spared those who fell before him. In the deserts of Syria and the hills of Palestine, his name became more than a command. It became a lesson, because for every sword raised in God's name, Saladin proved that faith is strongest in the hands that choose restraint. This isn't just a story about war, it's the story of how mercy defeated madness, of how compassion silenced conquest, of how one man's honor outlived every empire. The Crusades began as a cry for heaven, but they ended in the heart of a man who found God in forgiveness.
It started with a sermon that set Europe on fire. In the chill of late November 1095, in the French town of Clermont, peasants and princes crowded together beneath a grey sky. The air smelled of damp wool and horse sweat, yet every face turned toward a single aging priest in white robes. Pope Urban II raised his hands and silence rippled through the crowd. He spoke of the East, of pilgrims beaten on the roads to Jerusalem, of churches desecrated, of the Holy Sepulchre in foreign hands. He described the infidels, the Turks and Saracens, as a scourge upon Christendom, and he promised something no king could grant: forgiveness. Whoever took up the sword in God's name, he said, would have his sins washed away forever. Then he thundered the words that would echo for 2 centuries: Deus vult, God wills it. The field erupted. Men wept, women knelt, knights ripped strips of cloth to sew crimson crosses onto their tunics. The shouts rolled like thunder across the hills: Deus vult, Deus vult. What began as a sermon became a movement. Europe's violence had found a holy excuse. Behind the faith burned hunger and ambition. Lords saw a chance for land, debtors for freedom, soldiers for glory. The church promised eternal reward, and whole villages vowed to march east. By the spring of 1096, tens of thousands were already on the roads, men, women, even children, driven less by discipline than by desperation. This first wave would be remembered as the People's Crusade, led by a fiery monk, Peter the Hermit. They carried no banners of kings, only faith and fear. They wandered through the Rhineland preaching salvation and leaving ruin behind. Jewish communities were massacred, fields were looted, towns burned. The pilgrimage had become a mob. When they reached the Byzantine capital, Constantinople, Emperor Alexios Komnenos stared in disbelief. He had asked Rome for trained knights to help him reclaim Asia Minor. Instead, he faced a starving horde at his gates. Yet he dared not offend the Pope. He ferried them across the Bosphorus and let them march into Turkish lands. Waiting for them was Kilij Arslan, Sultan of the Seljuks. At Civito, he surrounded them. The unarmed pilgrims broke, trampled one another, and were slaughtered. By nightfall, 30,000 lay dead. The People's Crusade had ended in dust, but Europe was not finished. Behind that disaster came the true armies, armored, organized, and led by princes. They called themselves the army of God, but marched for their own crowns. There were 4 great leaders: Godfrey of Bouillon, Duke of Lower Lorraine, devout and steady; Bohemond of Taranto, the Norman adventurer, sharp as a blade; Raymond of Toulouse, the wealthy elder; and Hugh of Vermandois, proud brother of the King of France. Behind them marched nearly 70,000 men, knights in steel, infantry in rags, priests clutching relics, traders, wives and servants dragging wagons toward a promise of salvation. When they reached Constantinople in 1097, Alexios greeted them with ceremony, but also fear. He demanded that each lord swear an oath to return all captured lands to Byzantium. They agreed with their lips, but not with their hearts. They had not come to serve the Greeks. They had come to carve kingdoms of their own. Their first target stood just beyond the capital, Nicaea, the Seljuk stronghold. For 6 weeks they battered its walls with catapults and siege towers. Then, before dawn, on June 19th, 1097, Byzantine envoys secretly negotiated the city's surrender. When the Crusaders awoke, imperial banners already fluttered from the ramparts. They were denied their plunder. Fury boiled. Mistrust between East and West was born that morning and would never heal. The Crusaders pressed onward across the burning plains of Anatolia. At Dorylaeum in July, Kili Arslan struck again. The Turks charged in waves, arrows darkening the sun. For hours, Bohemond's column fought alone, ringed by fire. Then Godfrey and Raymond arrived with reinforcements. Steel met horsehair. Dust turned to smoke. And by evening, the Turks withdrew. For the first time, Christian knights had beaten the armies of Islam in open battle. But victory brought no comfort. The march to Antioch was a slow death. The heat scorched armor, the cold nights cracked bones, horses perished by the thousands. Disease crept through the camps, yet they kept moving, chanting psalms, their eyes fixed on the east. When at last they saw Antioch, it rose like a stone crown above the plain, a city of saints and soldiers, ringed by walls 20 miles long. To control Antioch was to open the road to Jerusalem. To lose it was to die in the wilderness. The siege began in October 1097 and dragged through the winter. Food vanished. Men gnawed leather and boiled weeds. Some deserted, others turned fanatic. Then betrayal saved them. A guard named Firuz opened a gate under cover of night. Bohemond's men scaled the walls, slaughtered the defenders, and claimed the city. Their triumph lasted 3 days. From the east came Kaboka of Mosul with a massive army. Now the Crusaders were trapped inside the very fortress they had conquered. Famine returned, and despair stalked every tent. Then a vision changed everything. A poor priest claimed to have found the Holy Lance, the spear that pierced Christ. Whether relic or ruse, it rekindled faith. Barefoot and half-mad with hunger, the Crusaders charged out of the gates and against all odds broke the siege. Antioch was theirs, and Europe rejoiced. But Jerusalem still waited, far to the south, shimmering behind deserts and enemy lines. Another year passed before they reached it. The sun of June 1099 beat upon a weary host reduced to 20,000. The city's golden domes glinted in the distance like a promise and a test. The Fatimid Egyptians now held Jerusalem. Their garrison counted perhaps 10,000, fortified behind thick stone. Outside, the Crusaders built towers and rams from olive wood, fasting and praying between assaults. On July 13th, they advanced. Arrows hissed, oil poured, fire roared. 2 days later, Godfrey's tower reached the northern wall. He leapt across a broken parapet, followed by his men. By noon, the cross-bearers flooded into the streets. Then the city screamed. What followed was not holy. For 2 days, Jerusalem drowned in blood. Chroniclers wrote that men rode through the Temple Mount with blood up to their stirrups. Muslims were cut down in mosques, Jews burned alive in synagogues, even priests turned away from the horror. Yet for the victors, it was judgment fulfilled. They knelt at the church of the Holy Sepulchre, weeping and singing as smoke curled around them. The Pope's dream had become reality. The kingdom of Jerusalem was born. Godfrey of Bouillon refused a crown of gold, saying he would not wear one where Christ had worn thorns. He took instead the title Defender of the Holy Sepulchre. For the first time in 500 years, the city belonged to the West, but outside its walls, the Islamic world stirred. In Cairo, in Damascus, in Baghdad, the call went out. How could the city of prophets fall while believers quarreled? Sultans blamed emirs, scholars blamed kings. From the Tigris to the Nile, shame turned to resolve. They would not accept this forever. Among those who heard that call, far from the holy city, was a boy whose name no one yet knew beyond his village. A Kurdish child born in Tikrit, raised in the courts of Syria, trained in the art of patience and command. History would remember him as Salah al-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, Saladin. The world that the Crusaders had built in blood was the world he would one day remake. When the dust of Jerusalem's conquest settled, the West rejoiced, but the East began to awaken. In the mosques of Damascus, imams cried that the unity of Islam had shattered. In the palaces of Baghdad and Cairo, rulers whispered blame and fear. The Abbasids ruled only in name. The Fatimids were exhausted by intrigue. Between them stretched a patchwork of petty princes, each guarding his own fortress while the cross ruled the coast. For the first time since the rise of Islam, the heart of the faithful was in foreign hands. Yet out of humiliation, determination began to grow. Across the Euphrates, one warrior understood what had been lost. His name was Imad ad-Din Zengi, the governor of Mosul. Zengi was ruthless, ambitious, and deeply aware of history. He saw that no emir alone could defeat the Latin kingdom. Only unity could. So he began to forge it, first by fear, then by faith. He conquered Aleppo in 1198, welding the northern Syrian frontier into one blade. For 16 years he fought Christians and Muslims alike, subduing rivals and calling himself the Sword of Islam. In 1144, his chance came. North of the Euphrates lay Edessa, the weakest of the Crusader states, poorly garrisoned and far from Jerusalem. While its prince was away, Zengi struck. His soldiers scaled the walls under winter rain, and after a brutal fight, the first Crusader principality fell. For the Muslim world, it was the first breath of redemption. For Europe, it was terror. When the news reached the West, church bells tolled from Paris to Rome. The Pope called for a second crusade, and this time kings themselves answered. Louis VII of France and Conrad III of Germany took the cross. They promised to avenge Edessa, to restore Christian might, and to prove that God still favored the West. But the path to Jerusalem was long and unforgiving. In Asia Minor, Turkish horsemen cut their columns to pieces. Hunger, disease, and mistrust did the rest. By the time the royal armies reached Damascus in 1148, they were shadows of their former glory. The siege collapsed in confusion, and the Second Crusade ended not with victory, but with humiliation. Zengi himself had already been murdered by a servant. but his legacy survived. He had proved that Christian power could bleed. From his house rose a greater mind, Nur ad-Din Zengi, his son and successor. Where the father had united by fear, the son would unite by faith. Nur ad-Din rebuilt mosques and hospitals, restored courts of justice, and sponsored scholars to preach jihad, not as vengeance but as duty. He governed from Aleppo with both sword and book in hand. The people called him Al-Malik al-Adil, the just king. Under his rule, Syria began to heal. He curbed corruption, disciplined armies, and sent letters to distant governors urging unity. "If we fight each other," he wrote, "the enemy will own our cities while we count our coins." Slowly, the scattered emirates of the Levant began to breathe as one. It was in this world that a young Kurdish officer entered history. Born in Tikrit in 1137, he was the son of a soldier named Ayub and the nephew of a commander named Shirkuh. His name was Salah al-Din Yusuf ibn Ayub. At first, there was nothing remarkable about him. He was quiet, fond of poetry and theology, more scholar than warrior. But Nur ad-Din saw potential in his discipline and modesty. He placed him under his uncle's command, sending both men south on campaigns that would shape the next generation. In Egypt, the once mighty Fatimid Caliphate had decayed into chaos. Rival viziers plotted while Crusader fleets prowled the Nile Delta. Nur ad-Din sensed opportunity. He dispatched Shirkuh to restore order, and with him went the young Saladin. After a brutal struggle in 1169, Shirkuh triumphed but died only weeks later. The court turned to his nephew as the one man capable of holding Egypt together. At 30, Saladin became vizier of a kingdom older than Rome. At first, he appeared gentle and cautious. He reopened markets, reduced taxes, and gained the trust of Egyptians who had long despised foreign rulers. But behind that calm exterior, he began to dismantle the decaying Shia regime. One by one, he replaced Fatimid officials with Sunni administrators loyal to Nur ad-Din. When the last Fatimid caliph died in 1171, the name of the Abbasid caliph was once again proclaimed in Cairo's mosques. The schism that had divided Islam for 2 centuries had begun to mend. Saladin governed Egypt with a balance rare in his age. He rode daily among the markets disguised as an ordinary man to hear complaints firsthand. He punished corruption, rewarded learning, and revived trade. His soldiers loved him not for his wealth, but for his fairness. He ate their food, slept in their tents, and shared their hardships. Yet his humility never obscured his ambition, the liberation of Jerusalem. In Damascus, Nur ad-Din watched with pride and unease. His protege was now a ruler in his own right, commanding the richest land in the Muslim world. Letters between them grew tense. Nur ad-Din feared Egypt might slip from his control. But destiny made the decision for them. In 1174, Nur ad-Din fell ill and died, leaving no adult heir. Civil war erupted across Syria. Governors plotted, emirs raised their own banners, and the fragile unity of the Muslim world began to crack again. From Cairo, Saladin moved swiftly. He marched into Syria not as a conqueror, but as a restorer of order. In Damascus, crowds welcomed him with cheers. Aleppo resisted, then yielded. One by one, the cities of the north accepted his rule. He treated captured lords with courtesy, often granting them offices instead of prisons. By 1186, from the Nile to the Euphrates, almost the entire Arab heartland answered to his authority. His coin bore a single phrase, Al-Malik al-Nasser, the victorious king. But victory demanded vigilance. Along the coast, the Latin kingdom of Jerusalem had grown complacent. It stretched from Acre in the north to Ascalon in the south, a chain of fortresses glittering under the sun. Its knights feasted on imported wine, its merchants traded freely with Damascus, and its kings fought more among themselves than against the enemy. Yet peace bred arrogance, and arrogance summoned ruin. Among the Crusader lords was a man who seemed carved from cruelty itself, Reynold of Chatillon, lord of Querac and Montreal. Years of captivity had hardened him into a fanatic. He plundered caravans under truce, raided pilgrim routes, and even threatened to march on Mecca. When Muslim envoys protested, he laughed in their faces and mocked the Prophet. The outrage echoed across the east. Saladin swore publicly, "By God, I will kill him with my own hand." Tension built through the spring of 1187. Skirmishes along the frontier grew into open raids. Then in June, news came that Reynold had attacked a caravan traveling from Cairo to Damascus. Merchants, women, even Saladin's own sister among them. The Sultan saw it as the final insult. He summoned his emirs to arms. "This time," he said, "we fight not for land, but for faith." Across the Jordan Valley, banners rose like dawn. Drums thundered through Damascus as thousands of horsemen assembled. Saladin rode at their head in a plain white robe, his black banner trailing behind, a symbol not of vengeance but of unity. For the first time in a century, Islam was ready to meet the Crusaders as one. King Guy of Jerusalem, pressured by his nobles, mustered his own army at Sephoria. Advisors begged him to stay near the water sources, but pride prevailed. On July 3rd, he marched east toward Tiberias to relieve a besieged fortress, straight into the trap Saladin had prepared. The plain was called Hattin, a barren plateau crowned by two extinct volcanic hills known as the Horns. The summer heat was merciless. Saladin's men cut the roads to Lake Tiberias, denying the enemy water. They lit fires of dry grass to choke the Crusaders with smoke. By dawn of July 4th, the Frankish ranks were collapsing. Exhausted knights tried to break through. Arrows cut them down. The true cross, their holiest relic, was captured. King Guy was taken prisoner, and Reynold of Chatillon was dragged before the Sultan. Saladin offered the king water. Guy drank and passed the cup to Reynold. The Sultan stopped him. "You did not ask my leave," he said coldly, "and he who drinks from my hand is safe. But this man has broken every oath." He rose, drew his sword, and struck. The oath he had sworn years before was fulfilled. The Battle of Hattin shattered the Crusader kingdom. Within weeks, city after city surrendered. Acre, Nablus, Jaffa, even Bethlehem. Only Jerusalem remained. For the first time in 88 years, the crescent stood poised above the holy city. When news of Hattin reached the holy city, bells of alarm tolled through the narrow streets. Iftikhar al-Dawla, the Fatimid governor who once defended Jerusalem against the first Crusaders, was long gone. In his place stood Balian of Ibelin, a knight who had fought at Hattin and survived the ruin. Barely 3,000 soldiers, many wounded, now faced Saladin's host that darkened the hills around the city. On September 20th, 1187, the banners of the Ayyubids appeared on every ridge. Drums rolled like thunder. The people of Jerusalem gathered behind their walls, the same walls their grandfathers had taken in blood almost a century earlier. But now, the roles had reversed. The cross had become besieged. Saladin encamped on the Mount of Olives, the same hill from which Christ was said to have ascended. He ordered his tents placed so that the dome of the rock and Al-Aqsa Mosque were always in view. Every dawn, the muezzin's call carried across the valley, a sound the city had not heard in 88 years. For several days he sent envoys offering honorable surrender. Balian refused. "We will defend the city of our God," he said, "and if it falls, we will destroy it so that no one may have it." The siege began. Catapults hurled stones, arrows rained day and night. Saladin's engineers built siege towers higher than the ramparts. Inside, the defenders melted church bells for weapons, patched walls with timber and prayer. Women carried water, monks tended the wounded, and priests walked the battlements with relics held high. After a week, breaches opened in the northern wall. Muslim banners flickered over broken towers. Seeing resistance crumble, Balian sought parley. He asked the Sultan for terms of surrender, fearing a repeat of 1099. Saladin remembered that massacre. "I am not one who destroys," he replied, "but one who gives life." He promised safety to all who laid down arms. Christians would be allowed to ransom themselves. Those too poor would be freed in charity. On October 2nd, 1187, the 17th day of Rajab, the anniversary of the Prophet's night journey, the gates of Jerusalem opened. The crescent rose above the city once more. No bloodbath followed. Soldiers escorted civilians to markets where ransoms were paid. Merchants recorded names instead of casualties. Saladin himself ordered water and food for the poor who could not pay. He entered the city on horseback, not in triumphal gold, but in a plain white robe. At the dome of the rock, he dismounted, knelt, and pressed his forehead to the stone floor. The crowd around him wept. For the first time in generations, Jerusalem had returned without slaughter. On that same day, the muezzin climbed the restored minaret of Al-Aqsa and called the Adhan. The sound rolled through the streets that had once run with blood. Chroniclers wrote that even many Christians watching from the walls wept at the beauty of the voice. The cycle of vengeance had broken, if only for a moment, into mercy. Saladin ordered the churches respected. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre remained open to pilgrims. Priests were allowed to ring their bells. Christian quarters were left intact. Yet he also cleansed the sacred mosque where horses had once been stabled under Crusader rule. The walls were washed with rose water. Quranic verses hung in golden script, and the pulpit of Nur ad-Din, carved years before in hope of this victory, was finally installed. Outside the walls, the defeated waited. Thousands of captives sat under the sun hoping for release. Saladin's brother Al-Adil paid many ransoms himself. When the queen, Sibylla, approached weeping for her husband, the captured King Guy, Saladin spared him. "Kings do not kill kings," he said quietly. Reynald's body, long buried, remained the only one denied mercy. Justice had been done, and vengeance was complete. In the west, Jerusalem's fall struck like thunder. Churches filled with wailing, kings tore their garments. Pope Urban's dream of an eternal Christian holy land had vanished. Within months, a new call went out, the Third Crusade, led by the mightiest rulers of Europe, Richard the Lionheart of England, Philip II of France, and Emperor Frederick Barbarossa. But that is another story, one of storm-lashed ships, drowned emperors, and two great men who fought one another with both sword and honor. For now, the tide of history has turned. The age of conquest gave way to an age of balance. From Cairo to Damascus, markets reopened, scholars traveled safely, and pilgrims, Christian, Jewish, and Muslim, walked once more through Jerusalem's gates. The Sultan forbade revenge. "Do not repay evil with evil," he told his men. "We are not those who burned this city. We are those who rebuild." His victory sent ripples far beyond the battlefield. Poets wrote that he had restored the dignity of Islam, more with mercy than with arms. In Europe, even chroniclers who despised his faith called him a prince without equal in honor or courage. Where others saw fanaticism, he saw justice. Where others sought gold, he sought peace. Yet he never forgot the duty that had guided him from the deserts of Egypt to the hills of Palestine. Unity. As long as we remain one people, he said, Jerusalem will remain in our hands. Years later, when the treaty with Richard the Lionheart finally fixed the borders of peace, Saladin walked the ramparts of Jerusalem at sunset. The city glowed in amber light. Bells rang from distant churches. The call to prayer answered them like echo and refrain. The Sultan smiled. So long as these sounds rise together, he said, God is pleased with this place. He died in 1193 in Damascus, not in a palace but in a modest house. When the treasurer came to prepare his burial, he found only a few coins and a worn sword. The conqueror of kingdoms left nothing but a legacy of mercy. On his tomb were carved the words, "Nothing remains of Saladin, but this small plot of earth." The Crusades had begun as a sermon in France and ended, for a time, in compassion on Syrian soil. From Pope Urban's call to Saladin's prayer, a century of blood had reshaped the world. East and West had clashed, learned, and changed each other forever. The cross had marched into the East with iron. The crescent had answered with faith. Neither side would ever be the same again. The year was 1144, and the walls of Edessa trembled. For nearly half a century, Christian banners had flown above its citadel, red crosses fluttering over markets filled with Latin, Armenian, and Arabic voices. But on a cold December night, the defenders peered out to see new standards glinting in the torchlight, crescent emblems, black flags, and the name of a man whispered with both fear and hope, Imad ad-Din Zengi, Lord of Mosul. Edessa had been the weakest of the Crusader states, far from Jerusalem, cut off from help. Zengi knew that if he took it, the tide of the wars would turn. His engineers tunneled beneath the walls, filling the hollows with wood and oil. When they lit the fires, the ramparts caved in. His troops surged through the breach. By morning, Edessa had fallen. For the first time since 1099, a Christian stronghold returned to Muslim hands. Minarets echoed with the Adhan, and from Aleppo to Baghdad, believers wept in gratitude. The poets called Zengi, the reviver of jihad. Europe called him the butcher of Edessa. The news raced west like a thunderclap. In cathedrals from Paris to Cologne, priests described the infidel hordes defiling Christ's relics. The church responded with a new cry, the Second Crusade. This time, not mere lords but kings took the cross. Louis VII of France and Conrad III of Germany. They marched with banners of silk and hearts of iron, confident that God still favored the West. But God, it seemed, had changed the battlefield. While Europe prepared its expedition, the Muslim East was still fractured. The Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad was powerless. The Seljuk sultans fought one another, and Egypt's Fatimid caliphs clung to ritual instead of rule. Each city had its own master, Damascus, Aleppo, Mosul, Cairo, each jealous of the other. Zengi understood that the Crusaders had conquered not because they were stronger, but because Muslims had forgotten how to stand together. He ruled by terror and discipline, welding the northern cities into one spearhead. His soldiers feared him more than death itself. When he found a commander drunk while the enemy approached, he executed him with his own hand. "We fight for the faith," he said, "not for wine." Yet his power earned him enemies among the emirs he sought to unite. In 1146, While he slept in his tent after conquering Harran, one of his own servants crept inside and plunged a dagger into his chest. By dawn, the sword of Islam lay dead, but his dream did not die with him. His son, Nur ad-Din Mahmud Zengi, inherited not only his father's cities, but his vision. Where Zengi ruled with fear, Nur ad-Din would rule with faith. He was austere, devout, and tireless. Chroniclers describe him as a man who prayed half the night, judged fairly by day, and spent his wealth building schools, hospitals, and mosques instead of palaces. Under him, Aleppo and Damascus became beacons of renewal. He forbade luxury in his court, saying, "A ruler who adorns himself while his people hunger is not a ruler, but a thief." His soldiers respected him because he lived as one of them. He ate their bread, marched beside them, and rewarded merit, not birth. Nur ad-Din's greatest weapon was not his sword, but his idea, unity through justice. He declared that every Muslim, Arab or Turk, rich or poor, was bound by the same duty, to reclaim the lands of Islam from foreign rule. To that end, he created a new kind of state, one that combined spiritual legitimacy with military discipline. His armies bore banners embroidered not with tribal crests, but verses from the Quran. From Aleppo, he extended his authority over northern Syria, then toward the Mediterranean. He captured key fortresses from the Crusaders and rebuilt the roads between cities so that merchants and scholars could travel again without fear. Slowly, the frontier that had divided Islam began to fade. The Second Crusade falters. Meanwhile, the armies of Europe were disintegrating. Crossing Anatolia, they met ambush after ambush from Turkish horsemen. Disease, thirst, and poor leadership turned the crusade into a death march. Only fragments reached the Holy Land. In 1148, they attempted to besiege Damascus, the very city that had sheltered them in earlier years. For 4 days they fought the city's defenders, Muslims, who fought now not for a prince, but for faith itself. When the kings of France and Germany withdrew in defeat, the Muslims of Damascus celebrated not only survival, but the birth of a new confidence. The Crusaders could be beaten. Nur ad-Din became the symbol of that confidence. He built a great hospital in Damascus whose doors remained open day and night. Even his enemies could seek treatment there. He established madrasas where jurists debated the meaning of justice, and he made sure sermons throughout Syria ended with the prayer, "O God, grant victory to your servant Nur ad-Din." But he knew victory required more than prayer. To the south, Egypt was still ruled by the decaying Fatimid dynasty, its viziers conspiring with Crusader princes. Whoever controlled Egypt would control the trade of the Red Sea and the wealth to arm an empire. Nur ad-Din resolved to bring it back into the Sunni fold, and he would send his most trusted general to do it. That general was Shirkuh, a seasoned Kurdish warrior with eyes like steel and a temper to match. With him went his young nephew, a quiet man in his late 20s who preferred books to battles, but whose loyalty and discipline impressed every commander. His name was Salah al-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, the future Saladin. When they entered Egypt in 1164, they found a land drowning in intrigue. Vizier Shawah ruled in the name of a boy caliph al-Adid, but courted both Crusaders and Turks to keep his throne. Shirkuh's arrival threw the balance into chaos. For 5 years, Egypt changed hands like a coin in a gambler's palm, Cairo's streets echoing with the clash of armies and the shouts of rival faiths. Through it all, Saladin watched and learned. In 1169, Shirkuh finally triumphed but died within weeks of victory. The Fatimid court turned to his nephew for leadership. At 31, Saladin became Vizier of Egypt, the youngest in its history and the first Sunni to hold that office in 200 years. At first he seemed an unlikely ruler, soft-spoken, modest, uninterested in luxury. But beneath that calm lay iron resolve. He restored order with firm justice, cut the taxes that had bled the poor, rebuilt the navy, and reorganized the army under his own command. He replaced corrupt officials with honest men from Syria and slowly dismantled the Fatimid institutions. When the last Fatimid caliph died in 1171, the Friday sermon in Cairo once again invoked the Abbasid caliph of Baghdad. The centuries-old division between Sunni and Shia rule began to heal. Saladin's governance won him the hearts of Egyptians. He walked through Cairo without guards, listening to grievances in the markets. He banned public drunkenness, outlawed extortion, and ensured widows received pensions from the state treasury. His generosity became legend. If he heard of a family in debt, he sent money before they could ask. But his humility masked ambition. He wrote to Nur ad-Din pledging loyalty, yet he was now master of one of the richest lands in the world. The Syrian ruler watched uneasily as his protégé's fame grew. Letters between them became formal, even cold. Then in 1174, Nur ad-Din fell ill and died. He left behind a child heir and a power vacuum stretching from the Euphrates to the Nile. The emirs of Syria fought for succession. Cities closed their gates against one another. Saladin saw what his teacher had always feared. The unity of Islam was dissolving again. He acted quickly. Marching from Egypt with a small but loyal army, he entered Damascus not as conqueror, but as peacemaker. The citizens opened the gates to him, remembering his justice in Egypt. Better Saladin's rule than anarchy, they said. Within a year, Aleppo, Homs, and Hama acknowledged his authority. He treated rival princes with courtesy, offering them lands instead of chains. Through mercy, he achieved what armies had failed to win by force. By 1186, from the Nile Delta to the upper Euphrates, the banners of Ayyub fluttered over every major city. By the mid-1180s, Saladin had done what few rulers before him dared to dream. He united Egypt and Syria under a single banner. The long-divided lands of the Abbasids, Fatimids, and Seljuks were once again one voice, one army, and, most importantly, one purpose. Yet unity on parchment was not enough. The holy war that had slumbered for decades now demanded fire. In 1186, Saladin summoned his scholars, jurists, and commanders to the great mosque of Damascus. There, beneath lamps of brass and incense smoke, the chief Qadi recited verses of the Quran calling believers to defend the sacred. When he finished, Saladin rose. For 80 years, he said, Jerusalem has been in foreign hands. The sons of Islam have forgotten her, but God has not. His words rippled through the city like thunder. Messengers carried proclamations across the empire. The jihad had begun. From Yemen came volunteers, from Armenia deserters, from the Maghreb merchants who sold their caravans to buy horses. In Cairo, the blacksmiths forged new armor. In Aleppo, poets composed marching hymns. The dream of Nur ad-Din had become a living movement. But before the liberation of Jerusalem could be attempted, the Crusader kingdom itself had to be broken. For nearly a century, its castles, Kerak, Montreal, Ascalon, had formed a chain of stone from the Red Sea to the mountains of Lebanon. Saladin understood that to win the holy city, he must first shatter the chain. For years, a truce had kept uneasy peace between the Sultan and the Franks. Pilgrims traveled the roads, merchants traded across borders. Yet one man despised that peace, Reynold of Châtillon. lord of Kerak. His fortress loomed over the desert caravan routes like a predator. He raided pilgrims on their way to Mecca, seized merchants, and once threatened to march on the holy cities themselves. His arrogance burned hotter than the desert sun. When ambassadors protested, Reynald laughed. "Tell your Muhammad," he sneered, "to come save you." The insult reached every mosque. Even those once weary of war clenched their fists in outrage. In spring 1187, a caravan from Cairo to Damascus, laden with goods, women, and even the Sultan's own sister, fell into Reynald's hands. It was the last provocation Saladin would bear. "This man," he vowed before the court, "shall die by my hand." Across the empire, banners rose like dawn. From Egypt came mailed regiments of Sudanese infantry. From Aleppo, Kurdish horsemen. From the Jazeera, squadrons of Turkic archers. Chroniclers counted 40,000 men assembled near Damascus, the largest Muslim host since the early caliphates. Saladin rode among them in plain armor, his black standard trailing like a shadow. He forbade looting, reminded his men that they fought for faith, not plunder. "He who kills for gold," he said, "has already lost his reward." At the same time, in Jerusalem, King Guy of Lusignan and his nobles quarreled over how to respond. Some urged defense, others attacked. The hot-headed Grand Master of the Templars, Gerard de Ridefort, insisted that God would never allow them to fall. Against the counsel of the wise, they mustered every night and marched east toward the Sea of Galilee. Saladin's scouts shadowed them through the barren hills. He ordered wells poisoned, streams blocked, grass burned. The Frankish army, heavy with armor and relics, dragged itself through the haze. The July sun turned the earth into a furnace. By the third day, men collapsed beside dying horses. The Muslims surrounded them on the plateau called Hattin, two volcanic horns rising like watchtowers over the plain. That night, Saladin's soldiers circled the Crusader camp, beating drums and shouting the takbir until dawn. Exhausted, parched, and half-mad with thirst, the Crusaders formed ranks around the relic of the true cross. When the sun rose, the Muslims attacked from all sides. Arrows rained, fire swept the grass, smoke blinded the enemy. By noon, the Christian lines disintegrated. King Guy was captured, the true cross seized, thousands fell. Reynald of Chatillon was dragged before the Sultan. Saladin offered water to the king, but when Guy passed the cup to Reynald, the Sultan stopped him. "He who drinks from my hand is safe," he said, "but this man has broken every oath." He struck Reynald down himself, fulfilling the promise he had sworn before God. The field of Hattin became legendary. For the first time in generations, the cross had fallen and the crescent had risen. Chroniclers said the sky darkened with arrows and then cleared as if washed of sin. From that victory, the road to Jerusalem lay open. City after city surrendered: Acre, Nablus, Jaffa, even Bethlehem. Only Jerusalem held out under the command of Balian of Ibelin, a noble who had survived Hattin. On September 20th, 1187, Saladin's army appeared before the walls. Catapults thundered, towers creaked forward. Yet the Sultan did not want another massacre like that of 1099. He sent envoys offering honorable terms. Balian refused, vowing to destroy the city rather than yield. For days, battle raged. The eastern wall collapsed under explosions of Greek fire. When defenders faltered, Balian sought parley. Saladin, remembering the horrors of the first conquest, promised mercy. Civilians could ransom themselves. The poor would be freed by charity. On October 2nd, 1187, the anniversary of the Prophet's night journey, the gates opened. The crescent rose over the dome of the rock, and no blood was shed. Saladin entered in a plain white robe. He dismounted, knelt, and prayed. The call to prayer echoed across the same stones where Crusaders once sang Te Deum. Even Christian chroniclers admitted his clemency. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre remained open. Priests kept their bells. Al-Aqsa was cleansed with rose water, and Nur ad-Din's long-prepared pulpit was installed at last. The holy city was whole again. When word of Jerusalem's fall reached Europe, churches fell silent in grief. Bells tolled from Rome to London. The Pope proclaimed a new crusade, this time to be led by kings. Richard the Lionheart of England, Philip II of France, and Emperor Frederick Barbarossa took the cross. It would become the Third Crusade, the greatest clash of the age. But before those armies could arrive, Saladin had to consolidate what he had gained. He reorganized defenses, restored order in captured cities, and forbade vengeance. Let no man think victory gives him license over the weak, he commanded. Justice is the sword that guards the realm. In Cairo, the scholars praised him as Al-Malik al-Nasir, the victorious king. In Damascus, poets compared him to the early caliphs. Yet the Sultan remained humble. His tent was simple, his meals of barley bread and lentils. When asked why he did not rest after such triumph, he replied, "How can the servant of God sleep while his house is in danger?" He knew the storm from the west was already sailing. He could almost hear the drums of Europe rolling across the sea. In the spring of 1189, the coasts of the Levant began to tremble. Ships with red and white crosses crowded every harbour of the Mediterranean. The Third Crusade had come. Emperor Frederick Barbarossa marched first, leading an army through Anatolia so vast that chroniclers compared it to a moving city. Yet fate intervened. While crossing a narrow river in Cilicia, the aging emperor was swept away by the current and drowned. His soldiers, leaderless and demoralized, drifted back to Europe. Only fragments reached the Holy Land. The real challenge came from the sea. Richard I of England, called the Lionheart, and Philip II of France arrived in 1191 with fleets bristling like floating fortresses. They landed at Acre, a port still resisting after 2 years of siege. Inside its walls were 10,000 Muslim defenders, outside tens of thousands of Crusaders. Between them, starvation and disease. Saladin encamped in the hills overlooking the city. Day and night his archers harassed the enemy, but he could not break their grip. In July, Acre finally fell. The Sultan agreed to pay ransom for the captured garrison. Yet when the payment was delayed, Richard ordered the prisoners, over 2,000 men executed before the walls. The screams carried across the plain. Saladin watched in silence, his face like stone. "Let him have his way," he said. "Every soul has its appointed hour." The struggle that followed became legend. Richard and Saladin never met in person, yet their rivalry forged one of history's greatest duels of honor. Where earlier wars had been crusades of fury, this became a contest between warriors who understood both valor and restraint. Richard's campaigns were lightning swift. He recaptured Jaffa, defeated Muslim forces at Arsuf, and advanced toward Jerusalem. Saladin, outnumbered, refused direct battle. He withdrew step by step, scorching the earth, preserving his army. "Victory," he told his generals, "belongs to him who endures the longest, not him who strikes the hardest." At Arsuf, September 7, 1191, the two hosts collided near the sea. For hours the plain shook with the clash of steel. When the Muslim left faltered, Saladin rallied it himself, galloping bareheaded into the storm. The Lionheart countercharged with the Knights Templar at his side, cutting through the lines before reforming with perfect discipline. neither king broke. When dusk fell, both armies withdrew, each claiming success. Chroniclers said the field looked like a carpet of armor glittering with blood. Through the winter of 1191-92, Richard advanced toward Jerusalem, but halted twice within sight of its walls. Rain turned the roads to rivers, disease consumed his men, and he knew that even if he captured the city, he could not hold it. Saladin, watching from the hills, strengthened the fortifications but sent envoys bearing fruit, snow, and medicines for the sick. War had not extinguished chivalry. One story, told by both sides, captured their strange respect. During an illness, Richard requested peaches and ice. Saladin sent both with a personal physician. When Richard recovered, he returned the courtesy, sending the Sultan fine European falcons. Enemies in arms, they were brothers in honor. Yet beneath the courtesy lay exhaustion. Both armies were bleeding gold and men. The Sultan's treasury was nearly empty. He had pawned his own jewelry to pay the troops. Richard's barons begged to go home. At last, diplomacy offered what swords could not. In September 1192, the two leaders met through emissaries at Ramla, near Jaffa. The treaty they forged would end the Third Crusade. Its terms were simple. The coastal cities from Tyre to Jaffa would remain in Crusader hands. Jerusalem would stay under Muslim rule, but be open to Christian pilgrims. And a truce of 3 years would bind both sides. When the agreement was sealed, Richard is said to have looked toward the distant hills and whispered, "How fair is that land we shall not see." Saladin, hearing of his departure, sent him gifts, Arab horses, fruit, and snow from Lebanon to cool the voyage home. "He is a great prince," the Sultan said, "and if God so wills, we shall meet again in paradise." The treaty restored the fragile balance of faiths in the Holy Land. Pilgrims once again walked the roads to the sepulchre, escorted not by knights but by Muslim guards who protected them for a small toll. Traders reopened the ports, farmers returned to ruined fields. For a moment, the war that had consumed 2 continents paused to breathe. Peace did not bring rest to Saladin. His health, worn by years of campaigning, began to fail. In the winter of 1193, he returned to Damascus. The chronicles tell of him sleeping little, spending his nights distributing alms. On his final morning, he called for his steward. "Count what I possess," he said. They found a single gold coin, 40 silver pieces. In the year 1137, on the windswept banks of the Tigris, a child was born who would change the map of the world. His name was Yusuf ibn Ayyub, the man history would remember as Saladin. Tikrit, his birthplace, lay between collapsing empires. To the east stretched the remnants of the Abbasid Caliphate. To the west, the Crusader strongholds carved from the flesh of Syria. The region was a frontier where caravans and armies crossed the same dust. His father, Ayyub, served as a modest Kurdish officer. His uncle, Shirkuh, already held a reputation for bravery that bordered on recklessness. On the night of Saladin's birth, his father's patron was disgraced, forcing the family to flee Tikrit before dawn. Their boat drifted down the dark Tigris toward Mosul, a journey that became the first lesson of the boy's life, that fortune changes faster than the current of a river. Mosul, where the family found refuge, was ruled by Imad ad-Din Zengi, the iron-willed warlord who had first united Muslims against the Crusaders. There, young Yusuf watched 2 kinds of men, the scholars who reasoned and the warriors who obeyed. He admired both, but belonged fully to neither. He studied the Quran, mathematics, Arabic poetry, and the biographies of early caliphs. His teachers recalled a quiet student with searching eyes, more interested in justice than in glory. He would spend hours copying passages about mercy and discipline, two virtues that would later define his rule. But outside the classroom, the world was aflame. News of Christian conquests and Muslim rivalries reached Mosul daily. The sermons in every mosque spoke of jihad, yet the word meant something broader than war. It meant struggle, the inner battle to live rightly in a world gone wrong. Saladin absorbed that meaning deeply. The struggle of the soul came first. The sword would follow only when duty required it. When Saladin was still a youth, his father entered the service of Nur ad-Din Zengi, son of the great Imad ad-Din and ruler of Damascus. The move south changed everything. Damascus was the beating heart of Arab culture, a city of gardens, scholars, and soldiers. Here, Saladin encountered civilization in its highest form, the calligraphy of Ibn al-Bawab, the medicine of Avicenna, the architecture of the Umayyads. Nur ad-Din himself was a paradox, pious, yet pragmatic, severe, yet visionary. He prayed at midnight and led armies at dawn. Where other princes collected jewels, he collected learned men. He saw in the young Kurd a potential few others noticed. Saladin was reserved, cautious with words, and almost painfully modest. But Nur ad-Din valued precisely those qualities. Better a slow thinker who fears God, he said, than a quick one who fears nothing. Under his mentorship, Saladin learned statecraft, how to balance zeal with reason, and how to wield power without becoming its prisoner. He accompanied Nur ad-Din on campaigns, observing how fortresses were taken not only by force but by patience, supply lines, and negotiation. Every day became a lesson in leadership. In 1164, Nur ad-Din faced a dilemma. Egypt, ruled by the crumbling Fatimid Caliphate, was collapsing under internal corruption. Crusader fleets lurked near its ports, ready to seize the Nile. The survival of Islam's heartlands depended on preventing that fall. He chose his most trusted general, Shirkuh, to lead an expedition and insisted that Saladin go with him. The young man protested. He preferred books to battles, strategy to bloodshed. Nur ad-Din smiled and said, "Then you will see what your books are written about." The campaign to Egypt was a crucible. Saladin marched across deserts, through starvation, and into the chaos of Cairo's politics. He witnessed both courage and cruelty, loyalty and treachery. His uncle Shirkuh fought brilliantly but ruthlessly. Saladin recorded the horrors that followed victory. "He who rejoices too loudly in triumph," he wrote later, "has forgotten how many mothers mourn it." After years of shifting alliances, Shirkuh's army triumphed. In 1169, the Fatimid Caliph appointed Shirkuh as vizier of Egypt, supreme commander and administrator. 2 months later, Shirkuh died suddenly of illness, leaving no heir but his quiet nephew. Court officials looked to Saladin as a temporary compromise, a man they thought would be easy to control. They were wrong. Within weeks, he reorganized the treasury, disciplined the army, and began purging corruption. He reduced taxes on farmers, rebuilt irrigation canals, and fed the poor during famine. Cairo had not seen such order in a generation. He refused luxury. He lived in a modest house near the mosque, ate coarse bread, and drank water from a clay cup. When foreign envoys mocked his simplicity, he replied, "A man who conquers desire conquers empires." Yet even as he restored Egypt, Saladin's loyalty was questioned. Nur ad-Din, still ruling in Damascus, feared that his lieutenant was growing too powerful. Letters grew cold, spies whispered. Saladin continued to send tribute and prayers in his master's name. But he also prepared for independence, not out of ambition, but necessity. Egypt's stability depended on strong, immediate rule. Distant commands from Damascus could not respond to Nile floods or Crusader raids. Saladin had to act. He trained a new army, loyal not to tribe or faction, but to principle. He established schools of Sunni theology to heal the century-old divide between Fatimid Shia and Abbasid Sunni. His purpose was not revenge, but unity. When Nur ad-Din died in 1174, the Islamic world plunged into confusion. Princes fought for his legacy, and crusaders saw their chance. From Cairo, Saladin prayed for guidance and then marched north, not as conqueror but as restorer. "If God wills," he declared, "we shall be one people again." By diplomacy more than by the sword. He entered Damascus peacefully. The citizens welcomed him as a savior who brought justice instead of plunder. In the mosques, the preachers thanked God for a ruler who valued learning above luxury. When rival commanders challenged him, he spared their lives and gave them positions in his own court. His mercy disarmed rebellion more effectively than his armies. Across Syria, cities that once fought each other now pledged allegiance to him. The Muslim world, long divided by jealousy and doctrine, began to sense the rise of something new, a leader who fought not for himself but for an idea. That idea was unity under faith and law. "The sword of justice," he said, "must cut both enemy and friend if both are unjust." Such discipline made even his enemies respect him, for they saw that his ambition served a purpose greater than crown or gold. By the year 1186, Saladin had achieved what no ruler since the early caliphs had managed: a single Muslim front stretching from the Nile to the Euphrates. He governed not through fear, but through moral authority. In his councils, scholars sat beside generals. Decisions were weighed by ethics as well as strategy. The world had begun to whisper his name. Merchants in Damascus spoke of his honesty, pilgrims in Mecca of his generosity, and Crusader knights of his discipline. Even in Europe, his reputation grew. Chroniclers who despised Islam still admired the man who embodied its virtues. They called him the king without pride. Yet peace was fragile. In the Latin kingdom of Jerusalem, reckless lords violated the truce, raiding Muslim caravans and murdering pilgrims. The anger of decades ignited once more. Saladin, who had spent his life uniting Islam, would now be forced to defend it. The making of the man was complete. The testing of the legend was about to begin. The year 1174 had changed everything. Nur ad-Din was gone, and the fragile unity he had built was dissolving into rivalry. From Aleppo to Mosul, ambitious emirs fought for fragments of his legacy. Into this chaos marched the new governor of Egypt, Saladin, with barely 10,000 men and a mission that was half diplomacy, half destiny. He did not storm cities, he surrounded them with patience. He wrote letters before sending arrows. He reminded rival lords that Christians watched from the coast, ready to strike should Muslims fight each other. Many yielded without resistance, persuaded by his calm logic rather than fear of his army. When the walls of Damascus opened to him in 1174, he entered not as a conqueror, but as a guest. The citizens were astonished to see no plunder, no forced tribute, only order. "He who conquers a city by kindness," he said, "builds a fortress in every heart." For 2 years, Saladin worked to rebuild Syria. He reorganized courts, ended petty taxes, and appointed judges known for integrity. Soldiers were ordered not to seize land or livestock from peasants. "They feed the army," he told his generals. so protect them as you would your own children. Every evening he walked through Damascus disguised as an ordinary man to see how his decrees were followed. When he found a merchant cheated or a widow ignored, he corrected the injustice personally. His aides once urged him to delegate these tasks. He replied, "Justice delegated becomes injustice delayed." Even in war, his faith ruled his hand. Before battle, he forbade his troops to harm civilians, to destroy crops, or to burn churches. Captured enemies were to be fed before the soldiers ate. The sword that kills mercy, he warned, kills victory as well. These were not empty words. His men watched him live by them. Across the Jordan River, the Latin kingdom of Jerusalem seethed under internal conflict. King Baldwin IV, the young monarch stricken with leprosy, ruled a court divided by greed. Among his barons, the most reckless was Reynald de Chatillon, a man whose arrogance would ignite the next war. Reynald violated truces, ambushed caravans, and enslaved Muslim pilgrims. Each outrage reached Saladin's ears like a personal insult, yet for years he restrained his anger. He sent envoys to Jerusalem, reminding the king of peace treaties. He paid ransom for hostages with his own treasury. But when Reynald raided a caravan bound for Mecca and mocked the prophet of Islam, Saladin swore before his council, "I will kill him with my own hand." The time for patience had ended. In 1183, Saladin began assembling an army unlike any the region had seen in decades. From Egypt came disciplined infantry and Nubian archers. From Syria rode Kurdish and Turkmen cavalry. Tribal banners once divided by rivalry now flew side by side under the green flag of the Ayyubids. His strategy was revolutionary: mobility over mass, endurance over show. He drilled his cavalry to fight in rotating waves, exhausting the enemy with arrows before closing in. He built vast supply lines through oases, ensuring his forces could outlast the Crusaders in the open desert. When his scouts reported Crusader armies gathering near the plateau of Hattin, Saladin knew the hour had come. "They think God sleeps," he said, "but he has only waited for this day." The summer of 1187 was mercilessly hot. King Guy of Jerusalem marched his knights from the cool springs of Sepharis into the arid plains west of Tiberias, chasing Saladin's elusive army. Deceived by false retreats, they found themselves trapped between fire and thirst. Saladin's cavalry encircled them, burning the dry grass so that smoke and heat suffocated men and horses alike. At dawn on July 4th, the Muslim horn sounded from every ridge. Arrows darkened the sun. By noon, the Crusader formation had disintegrated. Surrounded on the hill of Hattin, beneath the relic of the true cross, the Christian host collapsed. King Guy was captured alive. By his side stood Reynald de Chatillon, still defiant. Saladin offered him water, a gesture of mercy. Then he said quietly, "You gave no water to my pilgrims." Drawing his sword, he struck once. The man who had mocked faith lay dead. The rest of the prisoners were spared. The king was sent to Damascus under guard, unharmed. The contrast was deliberate: justice without cruelty, victory without vengeance. Hattin shattered the Crusader world. In a single day, the armies of Jerusalem ceased to exist. For the first time in nearly 90 years, the road to the holy city lay open. After Hattin, cities surrendered one after another: Acre, Nazareth, Caesarea, Nablus. Each was treated with restraint. No massacre, no burning, only amnesty for those who yielded. Chroniclers, even Christian ones, recorded disbelief at his mercy. "Never did a conqueror forgive so much," wrote William of Tyre. Saladin now commanded an empire stretching from Yemen to the Euphrates. Yet he refused to crown himself king. "Only God is the sovereign," he said. Instead of gold or marble palaces, he built schools, libraries, and hospitals. He funded scholars and physicians, urging them to serve people of every faith. His personal wealth was non-existent. When treasurers tallied his estate years later, they found no gold, only a sword, a Quran, and a worn cloak. "He owned the world," said one historian, "but left it owning nothing." By September 1187, Saladin's banners appeared before the walls of Jerusalem. The city had been in Crusader hands since 1099, almost 90 years. Inside were tens of thousands of desperate civilians and a few hundred knights led by Balian of Ibelin. Saladin sent a message: "Surrender, and all lives will be spared." The defenders refused. For days, siege engines hurled stones, miners dug beneath the walls. At last, a breach opened. Realizing further resistance meant slaughter, Balian requested terms. Saladin agreed to peace on one condition: each citizen would pay a small ransom and depart freely. Those who could not pay would not be harmed. When poor families wept before him, he ordered his treasury open to cover their debts. Even widows and orphans walked safely from the gates. On October 2nd, 1187, the banners of Islam rose above Jerusalem. The city taken with mercy was celebrated without blood. On the very date, Muslims commemorated the Prophet's night of ascension. The place of that miracle returned to their care. News of Jerusalem's fall raced across the Mediterranean like a storm. In Europe, churches tolled in mourning. Kings swore new vows of crusade. In the Muslim world, poets compared Saladin to the caliphs of old. Yet he showed no pride. Standing in the courtyard of Al-Aqsa, he whispered to his aide, "Praise be to God who allowed me to clean his house, not for my sake, but for his mercy." He ordered both the Dome of the Rock and Al-Aqsa Mosque to be purified with rosewater. Christian holy sites were left untouched. Guards were posted to prevent looting. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre remained open, its priests unharmed. "Their Lord and ours is one," he said, "only our paths differ." Thus the conqueror of Jerusalem became something rarer, a symbol of moral victory. Even his enemies would one day call him noble. In the months that followed, Saladin issued decrees that defined the chivalric code of the East. Soldiers were forbidden to mock prisoners. Women and monks were to be protected. Loot was to be divided fairly, and war to cease after sunset prayers. When one of his emirs boasted of burning villages near Tyre, Saladin dismissed him. "Bravery," he said, "is not measured by smoke but by restraint." To another commander who demanded revenge for a slain brother, he wrote, "The grave is large enough for both. Leave justice to God." These acts were not strategy, they were belief. His discipline turned followers into devotees. The army became not merely a force but a movement bound by ethics as tightly as by loyalty. By the winter of 1188, Saladin's name had become a legend sung from Cairo to Damascus. Yet he remained the same man who once preferred books to battles. On campaign nights he still read poetry and wrote letters to his sons urging kindness. "Conquer your heart," he told them, "and the world will conquer itself." But peace would not last. Across the sea, Europe was already arming for the Third Crusade. 3 kings of England, France, and the Holy Roman Empire were preparing to sail east, each vowing to reclaim the Holy City. Saladin's greatest test was still ahead. Barely had the rose water dried on the stones of Al-Aqsa when the storm clouds gathered again, this time not over Syria or Egypt, but across the sea. The news of Jerusalem's fall had shaken Europe to its core. In cathedrals from Paris to London, priests thundered from their pulpits, calling kings and peasants alike to reclaim the city of God. 3 crowns answered the call: Frederick Barbarossa, Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, Philip II of France, and Richard the Lionheart of England, the warrior the West would call the Lionheart. They vowed to crush Saladin's empire and restore the cross to the Holy City. For Saladin, this was no ordinary invasion. The armies coming now were not fractured nobles or local barons. They were Europe's might itself. He gathered his council in Damascus. "We have taken Jerusalem by faith," he told them, "and we will defend it by patience. If we hold fast to justice, God will hold fast to us." The first blow came at the coastal fortress of Acre in 1189. The Crusaders, led by Guy of Lusignan, the same king captured and spared after Hattin, laid siege to the city. Saladin rushed north with his army to surround them in turn. For 2 long years, the two forces faced each other. Crusaders besieging the city, Muslims besieging the besiegers. The battlefields became mud and graves. Thousands died not by the sword, but by disease and famine. Saladin rode constantly among his troops, rallying them, feeding the poor, and writing letters to distant rulers for aid. "Every grain of sand between Acre and Jerusalem," he wrote, "belongs to God, and we will not surrender even one." But patience has limits. When Richard the Lionheart finally landed in 1191 with fresh armies, ships, and siege engines taller than the city walls, the balance shifted. Acre's exhausted garrison could no longer hold. Despite Saladin's pleas, they surrendered under a promise of mercy. Richard broke that promise. On August 20th, he ordered 3,000 Muslim prisoners executed outside Acre's walls, men, women, and children alike. When Saladin received the news, he bowed his head in silence. Then he said quietly, "Every man dies once, but a king dies each time he breaks his word." After Acre, Richard advanced south along the coast, his fleet shadowing him at sea. Saladin's scouts reported every movement. The Sultan chose patience over pride. He would not fight on ground of the enemy's choosing. He ordered his cavalry to harass the flanks, burn grass to deny fodder, and strike supply lines, but never to be drawn into a trap. For days the two armies marched within sight of each other, separated only by dunes and dust, the Crusaders in shining mail, their banners whipping in the wind, the Muslims in flowing robes silent and shadow-like among the hills. Each step was a test of endurance, each hour a contest of will. At last, near the wooded village of Arsuf, the moment came. On September 7th, 1191, the Lionheart's army moved through a narrow path between the forest and the sea. Saladin saw his chance. He unleashed wave after wave of cavalry, arrows raining from the dunes. The Crusaders staggered, their formation bending under the storm. Then Richard, seizing the instant, shouted his order. The entire Christian line turned and charged, lances down, horses thundering. The clash shook the earth. The Muslims, light and fast, but fewer in number, were driven back. Dust and cries filled the air. By sunset, the Crusaders held the field. Saladin had lost the day, but not his composure. He rallied his men calmly and withdrew into the hills. One of his captains wept, but Saladin said, "Victory and defeat are like night and day. Neither lasts forever." Though Richard claimed triumph, he could not pursue. His soldiers were exhausted, and Saladin's forces still surrounded them, like the desert itself. Both armies rested, both kings pondering their next move. After Arsuf, Richard captured the coastal city of Jaffa and strengthened his position. From there, Jerusalem was only 70 kilometers away. Winter rains turned roads to rivers, but the Crusaders pressed on. By early 1192, the Holy City's walls were visible from their camps near Ramallah. Saladin's spies brought him constant updates. He ordered wells around the city poisoned and fortifications doubled, but he also prayed more than he planned. If we must fall, he told his imam, let it be in God's sight, not man's. Richard rode to the hills overlooking Jerusalem. He gazed at its golden domes through the rain, then turned away. I will not enter the city I cannot keep, he said. He knew that even if he conquered Jerusalem, Saladin's armies would return the moment he sailed home. Thus, the unthinkable happened. The Third Crusade ended without a final siege. The greatest general of Europe and the greatest leader of Islam had met, and neither could destroy the other. Despite the bloodshed, the two men developed a strange respect for each other. They never met face to face, yet exchanged gifts and courtesies. When Richard's favorite horse was killed in battle, Saladin sent him 2 new ones, saying, "It is unfit for a king to fight on foot." When Richard fell ill, Saladin sent fruit, snow to cool his fever, and a message: "We are both servants of the same God, though we walk different roads." Their chivalry astonished chroniclers. One European writer noted, "Never has war worn such courtesy." In truth, both men saw in the other a reflection of themselves: courage, faith, and honor. They fought for different heavens, but with the same heart. By the summer of 1192, both armies were exhausted. Saladin's men longed for home. Richard's wanted ships to England. Messengers passed between their camps, negotiating what neither side could win by the sword. Finally, on September 2nd, 1192, the Treaty of Jaffa was signed. The Crusaders would retain a narrow coastal strip from Acre to Jaffa. Muslims would keep Jerusalem. Christian pilgrims could freely visit the Holy City under Muslim protection. When the treaty was sealed, Richard sent word to meet Saladin. The Sultan declined politely. 2 swords cannot be in one sheath, but the hearts that wield them may yet find peace. Before departing, Richard said to his envoys, "Tell the Sultan this: if God grants me life, I will return to take Jerusalem." When the message reached Saladin, he smiled. "Then may God forbid it," he said, "or make him return as a friend." The Lionheart sailed home. He never came back. After the Crusaders departed, Saladin returned to Damascus. Years of constant campaigning had drained his body, but not his spirit. He continued to govern, forgive, and give away wealth as if gold were dust. He refused tribute from conquered cities, saying, "The victory belongs to God, not to my purse." In March 1193, he fell ill. His doctors pleaded with him to rest, but he insisted on attending prayers until he could no longer stand. When the end approached, he ordered his possessions counted. There was nothing left, no palace treasures, no war spoils. He had given everything to charity. He asked that his funeral procession carry a simple piece of cloth before his coffin. The herald was to cry out, "Behold what the conqueror of kings takes with him from this world, nothing." He was buried in Damascus, not in marble, but beneath plain stone. The man who had united Islam, defeated empires, and redefined honor died with empty hands and a full heart. Centuries passed, but Saladin's name never faded. Even his enemies spoke of him with reverence. Richard the Lionheart's chroniclers wrote that he was the mirror of all chivalry. To Muslims, he became the symbol of justice guided by faith. To Christians, proof that virtue is not confined by creed. He had turned the chaos of divided kingdoms into a vision of unity. He had transformed jihad from mere battle into moral struggle, the fight to master oneself before mastering others. In the end, Saladin's greatest victory was not the fall of Jerusalem or the defeat of Crusaders. It was the triumph of mercy over vengeance, of humility over pride. He proved that true power does not come from fear, but from conscience. In the chronicles of war, few names shine without blood. Saladin's does. His story reminds the world that faith can conquer without hatred, and that justice, when tempered with compassion, endures beyond empires. Even now, more than 8 centuries later, his tomb in Damascus bears no jewels, only the inscription, "Nothing endures except good deeds." And perhaps that is why his legend endures, not as a conqueror of cities, but as the conqueror of himself. The summer of 1187 was one of the hottest in living memory. The plains of Galilee shimmered under a brutal sun. For weeks, Sultan Saladin had maneuvered his army like a chess master, cutting off Crusader strongholds one by one. His scouts shadowed every movement of the Christian host. In Jerusalem, panic reigned. Messengers galloped between fortresses, carrying word that Muslim banners had been seen across the Jordan, near Tiberias. The king of Jerusalem, Guy of Lusignan, gathered his knights, the proud remnants of a kingdom built on arrogance and miracle stories. They believed their God would never let them fail. The Knights Templar and Hospitaller, armored like steel walls, pressed for war. Better to die fighting than to watch Jerusalem fall, they said. Their arrogance blinded them to the trap waiting beyond the horizon. Saladin understood the Crusaders' pride better than they did themselves. He knew that to destroy them, he must first make them move. In July, he attacked the fortress of Tiberias, a small but symbolic outpost near the Sea of Galilee, defended by Count Raymond of Tripoli's wife, Eschiva. When the Crusaders heard she was surrounded, fury burned through their ranks. King Guy's council met at Sepphoris, where cooler heads advised caution. Raymond himself warned, "My lady is brave, she can hold Tiberias. But if we march now, we march to our graves." The Templars laughed. "You would leave your wife to the infidel," they jeered. Honor, or rather pride, made the decision for them. Against all wisdom, King Guy ordered the army to march east toward Tiberias. They carried little water. The sun was already rising. Saladin's scouts watched from the hills as the Crusaders trudged forward, thousands of men in heavy armor dragging siege engines across burning stone. Their supply wagons lagged behind. By the second day, water skins were empty. Horses collapsed. The air stank of thirst and despair. From the ridges, Saladin's cavalry began to circle like hawks. Arrows hissed from every direction. The Crusaders tried to keep formation, but the heat broke discipline faster than any sword. As night fell, they camped on a hill called Hattin, surrounded by Muslim forces and without a single spring in reach. Saladin ordered fires lit around the entire plain. The smoke rolled into the Crusader camp, choking men and beasts alike. There would be no sleep, no escape, no mercy. At dawn on July 4th, 1187, the horns of the Ayyubid army sounded from every ridge. The Crusaders, parched and delirious, formed their lines under a burning sky. The Muslim archers advanced in waves, loosing arrows until the sun itself disappeared in a storm of shafts. One Crusader chronicler later wrote, "The heat was such that the earth burned the soles of our feet through iron shoes." By midday, the Christian line shattered. The true cross, their holiest relic carried into battle, was captured. The Templar Grand Master fell with an arrow through his throat. By afternoon, it was over. The desert was silent except for the cries of prisoners. Saladin rode among the fallen, calm, composed, his white horse spattered with dust. The greatest army of Christendom lay broken before him. King Guy of Jerusalem and Reynald de Châtillon were brought before Saladin's tent. The Sultan received them seated, surrounded by his emirs. He offered the king cold water, which Guy drank gratefully, then passed to Reynald. Saladin stopped him. "You gave no water to my pilgrims," he said. "I will give you none." He drew his sword and struck once. The man who had mocked the prophet and butchered innocents was dead. Turning to the trembling king, Saladin said gently, "It is not the custom of kings to kill kings. Fear not." Guy bowed his head in silence. That night, the Sultan's tent was filled not with the sounds of celebration, but of recitation, verses of gratitude and restraint. The victory at Hattin had not just destroyed an army, it had ended the age of Crusader dominance. In the weeks that followed, the Crusader strongholds fell like dominoes. Acre, Nazareth, Caesarea, Nablus, Jaffa, all surrendered with little resistance. Cities that had defied Muslim armies for nearly a century now opened their gates willingly, knowing Saladin's reputation for mercy. No towns were burned, no women enslaved, no churches desecrated. Even Christian chroniclers recorded this with disbelief. "Never," wrote William of Tyre, "did a conqueror forgive so much." Saladin moved swiftly but not greedily. He ordered captured knights released for ransom, allowed civilians to return to their homes, and ensured that Christian pilgrims could continue their journeys under protection. His discipline restored peace faster than conquest ever could. For 88 years, Jerusalem had been in Christian hands. In 1099, the first Crusaders had entered the holy city with fire and blood, slaughtering thousands. Now, in the autumn of 1187, the Muslims stood at its gates once more, but with a leader who sought redemption, not revenge. Inside the city, panic spread. Balian of Ibelin, one of the last surviving nobles, commanded the defense. He had only a few hundred knights and thousands of terrified civilians. Women and children took up stones and wooden clubs, determined to die rather than surrender. Saladin sent a message: "If you surrender, all will live. Resist, and I cannot restrain my men." The defenders refused. For several days, the Ayyubid catapults hurled stones at the walls, while engineers mined the foundations. The city trembled under fire. On the fourth day, part of the wall near David's gate collapsed. Balian rode out under a white flag. Saladin and Balian met face to face in the Sultan's tent. Balian, exhausted and grim, said, "If you refuse our plea, we will burn the city, destroy your holy mosques, and kill every prisoner we hold. You will take nothing but ashes." The Sultan listened in silence. Then he spoke, "We do not destroy what is holy. We purify it." He offered terms that astonished even his generals. Every man would pay 10 dinars, every woman 5, every child 1, and be allowed to leave safely. Those who could not pay would be freed at his expense. When the gates opened on October 2nd, 1187, thousands of Christian families marched out in peace. Saladin ordered his treasury opened to free the poor. Widows and orphans wept at his feet. He gave them gold and safe passage. His brother, Al-Adil, personally paid the ransom for 1,000 captives. The city that had once run with blood now echoed with prayers of thanksgiving. For the first time in 9 decades, the Adhan, the Muslim call to prayer, rose again over Al-Aqsa Mosque. Saladin entered the sanctuary barefoot, tears streaming down his face. He knelt and whispered, "Praise be to God, who granted me the honor of restoring his house." The dome of the rock and Al-Aqsa were cleaned with rosewater and perfumed oil. The Crusader structures built within were removed. but the Christian churches remained untouched. Guards were posted at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre to protect it. When some advisors urged him to destroy it, Saladin refused. To harm a house where God is remembered, he said, is to harm faith itself. News of Jerusalem's fall struck Europe like thunder. Church bells tolled in mourning. Kings swore new vows of crusade. Pope Urban III is said to have died of grief upon hearing the news. In Muslim lands, joy spread like dawn after a long night. Poets compared Saladin to the first caliphs. Scholars called him the sword of God and the heart of mercy. But the Sultan remained humble. Victory, he told his men, belongs to God, not to us. He forbade extravagant celebrations. Instead, he ordered food distributed to the poor and commanded his soldiers to clean the city streets. For a moment, the world glimpsed what conquest could look like when guided by conscience. In the months after Jerusalem's capture, Saladin's empire stretched farther than any since the Abbasids. Yet his life remained austere. He refused silk robes, preferring rough linen. He ate the same bread as his soldiers. His treasury, swollen with spoils, was emptied again into charity. A scribe once found him mending his own cloak and asked why. Saladin smiled. When the needle is in my hand, pride cannot reach my heart. His enemies began to admire him as deeply as his followers. In European chronicles, he was no longer the infidel tyrant, but the noble Saracen. His name became legend, a ruler who conquered without cruelty, who ruled without fear, and who forgave without weakness. But pride is not easily buried. Across the sea, 3 kings prepared for revenge: Richard the Lionheart of England, Philip II of France, and Emperor Frederick Barbarossa of Germany. Their campaign would be called the Third Crusade, and it would bring the 2 greatest warriors of their age face to face. Saladin welcomed the challenge with calm resolve. "They come," he said, "as waves come to the shore. We will stand as the rock that endures them." The world was about to witness a clash not only of armies, but of ideals. The Lion of the West against the Falcon of the East. The Battle of Hattin had broken the Crusaders' pride. The fall of Jerusalem had shattered their myth. Yet Saladin's true victory lay elsewhere. He had proven that mercy could triumph over vengeance, that faith could guide politics, and that power could exist without cruelty. He had rewritten the definition of victory itself. No massacre followed his conquests. No temples were defiled. His justice became a legend greater than any sword. In the words of an Arab poet, he conquered the city with his hand, but he conquered the world with his heart. With Jerusalem restored, the Muslim world stood united for the first time in a century. Saladin's rule stretched from the Nile to the Euphrates, his justice binding diverse peoples under one law. In Europe, his name carried both fear and admiration, proof that chivalry was not the property of one faith alone. But Saladin knew what the world did not. This peace would not last. He looked from the walls of Jerusalem toward the sea and said softly, "They will come again." He was right. The next storm was already gathering. Sails rising on the horizon, bearing the flags of kings. History often celebrates those who win battles, but time remembers those who win hearts. At Hattin, Saladin broke an army. At Jerusalem, he healed a wound. His greatness did not lie in how many he defeated, but in how few he destroyed. When he prayed in Al-Aqsa, surrounded by soldiers who had once been enemies, he whispered to his son, "Remember, my child, the strongest fortress is mercy." The Crusaders had come for gold, glory, and salvation. Saladin came for justice. And in that, he found immortality. The smoke of Hattin still hung over Galilee when messengers reached Jerusalem. They carried a single sentence that chilled every heart. The army of the cross is no more. The knights who had sworn to defend the holy city were dead, captured, or scattered. Only fragments of the once proud host limped back to the walls of Jerusalem. Panic rippled through churches and marketplaces. Women wept, monks rang the bells in frantic prayer, and priests cried, "God will test us once more." Inside the royal palace, Queen Sibylla clutched her crown as if it could shield her. Her husband, King Guy, was a prisoner in Saladin's camp, and so the city turned to one man, a noble, a diplomat, and a reluctant warrior, Balian of Ibelin. Balian had fought at Hattin, but escaped capture. He reached Jerusalem exhausted, intending only to rescue his wife and children, then depart under Saladin's safe conduct. When he arrived, the people surrounded him, pleading, "Do not abandon us. Lead us, or we are lost." He sent a messenger to Saladin, reminding him of his promise of safe passage. The Sultan replied, "I granted your safety as a man of peace. If you take up arms, that promise is withdrawn, but your honor remains." Balian thought long that night. He prayed inside the empty church of the Holy Sepulchre, where candles flickered like fading hopes. At dawn, he told the citizens, "I am no king, but I will defend this city as if it were my soul." Saladin's response was quiet and inevitable. "Then God will decide." By early September 1187, the hills around Jerusalem were black with tents bearing the crescent of the Ayyubids. 50,000 soldiers formed a living wall around the holy city. From every direction came the rhythmic thud of catapults, the roll of siege towers, and the chant of Quranic verses echoing through the valley. Saladin positioned his headquarters on the Mount of Olives, facing the eastern wall. From there, he could see the golden domes of the Dome of the Rock and the Holy Sepulchre glinting together under the sun, symbols of two faiths and of one destiny. He ordered strict discipline, no looting, no desecration, no fire, he told his commanders. "This city belongs to God Isaka. We are merely his servants." Inside the walls, Balian prepared for a hopeless defense. He knighted every boy old enough to lift a sword. Monks forged arrowheads. Women carried stones to the ramparts. The people prayed, fought, and waited for a miracle that would not come. For nearly 2 weeks, Jerusalem endured an unending storm. Stones from Muslim mangonels smashed towers. Arrows fell like rain. Every night, Saladin's engineers moved their siege machines closer, filling the ditches with wood and sand. The defenders fought bravely. When one section of the wall collapsed, citizens formed a human chain to rebuild it with their own hands. Yet hunger and fear gnawed at every heart. Balian rode the walls daily, speaking to the soldiers. "If we die, let it be with honor. If we live, let it be by God's mercy." Below, Saladin observed through a brass telescope. He admired his enemy's courage. "If all Franks were like this man," he said, "Jerusalem would never have fallen." On the night of September 29th, Saladin ordered the great bombardment to begin. Hundreds of catapults roared in unison. The walls near David's Gate shuddered, then cracked. Fires raged within the city. The air reeked of smoke, sweat, and despair. At dawn, Muslim banners appeared atop a breached tower. Trumpets blared. The people of Jerusalem screamed that the end had come. Balian rode once more through the streets, shouting, "To the walls!" But his men were too few. Knowing the city could not withstand another day, he sent an envoy to Saladin, bearing a white flag and a message. "We will surrender if you grant safety to all within. If not, we will burn the city." the mosques, and the relics of the cross. We will leave you only ashes." Saladin listened in silence as the envoy spoke. His emirs argued for vengeance. "They massacred us in this city in 1099. Let their blood repay it." The Sultan rose slowly. "We do not avenge the sins of the dead upon the living," he said. "If God wills us to cleanse this city, let it be by mercy, not fire." He dictated his terms. Every man could ransom himself for 10 dinars, every woman for 5, every child for 1. Those who could not pay would be freed at the Sultan's expense. His advisers were astonished. "My lord, you will empty your treasury." Saladin smiled faintly. "Then it shall be empty in the service of God." On October 2nd, 1187, the gates of Jerusalem opened. Instead of soldiers charging in triumph, came order, silence, and discipline. Muslim troops entered in small detachments to maintain peace. Balian met Saladin at the city gates. The two men bowed. "You kept your word," Balian said. "And you kept your honor," replied the Sultan. The streets filled with weeping families leaving their homes. Saladin ordered his treasurers to pay the ransom of every poor person who approached. His brother Al-Adil redeemed hundreds more from his own fortune. Chroniclers wrote that over 10,000 captives were freed that day. Even Christian monks carried Muslim children safely through the crowd. The miracle of mercy replacing the miracle of war. That afternoon, the adhan rose over Jerusalem for the first time in 88 years. The sound drifted through the same streets where Crusaders had once cried victory in blood. Saladin entered Al-Aqsa Mosque barefoot. He wept as he prayed, whispering, "Praise be to God who allowed me to restore his house without cruelty." The dome of the rock was washed with rose water. The carpets replaced, the walls perfumed. No church was harmed. Saladin personally ordered guards for the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Pilgrims of every faith were to worship freely. "Their Lord and ours is one," he said. "Only our prayers differ." To the citizens watching from the walls, it seemed a different conquest. Not the revenge of the sword, but the triumph of conscience. For 3 days, the gates of Jerusalem remained open. The first to leave were the nobles who could pay their ransom. Behind them came the poor, orphans, widows, and servants, and for each, Saladin's officers weighed out gold from the royal treasury. A chronicler recorded, "The Sultan's tent became a court of charity. Men who came as prisoners departed as free souls." When all had gone, Saladin walked through the empty streets. He saw no laughter, no arrogance, only silence. He said to his aide, "In victory, there is no joy when one remembers how brief it is." He commanded that the city's wells be reopened, markets restored, and food distributed equally to Muslim and Christian poor alike. In his eyes, conquest was not complete until peace had returned. Among the treasures captured after Hattin had been the relic of the true cross, long carried by Crusader kings as a divine banner. It was brought to Jerusalem and displayed in Saladin's camp. When Christian envoys asked for its return, he refused, but not out of spite. "Let it rest," he said, "for symbols should sleep when men have forgotten their meaning." Instead, he granted permission for priests to hold Mass in the Holy Sepulchre, guarded by Muslim soldiers. The sound of church bells rang alongside the call to prayer, 2 voices rising to the same heaven. For a moment, Jerusalem belonged to everyone. Letters describing the surrender traveled across the world. Even in Europe, chroniclers wrote with awe. One monk in England recorded, "The infidel Saladin has shown more virtue than all our princes. In Damascus, scholars proclaimed that God had returned honor to Islam, but Saladin silenced their praises. "Do not call me the conqueror," he said. "Call me the forgiven, for God could have given this task to any hand." His humility deepened the legend. Merchants told tales of the Sultan who ransomed strangers. Poets compared him to the righteous caliphs of old. His name crossed oceans as both warning and example. The fall of Jerusalem in 1187 was more than a military event. It was a moral reversal of 1099. Where the Crusaders had once drowned the city in blood, Saladin washed it in mercy. He had turned vengeance into virtue. When a soldier boasted that he had slain many Franks, Saladin rebuked him. To kill the defeated is to murder victory itself. He saw mercy not as weakness, but as the final proof of strength, the moment when a man's faith overcomes his rage. In this, he transcended every general of his age. He did not simply win Jerusalem, he redeemed it. In the months that followed, pilgrims from every land arrived to see the peaceful city. Christian priests thanked the Sultan for his protection. Jewish families, exiled for nearly a century, returned to rebuild their quarter under his permission. One rabbi wrote, "Under the shade of his justice we found the peace of Abraham." For the first time since the First Crusade, Jerusalem became what it had always been meant to be, a city of God, not of conquest. Fame is a trial sharper than any blade. Gifts poured in from every province, gold, silks, horses. Saladin accepted none for himself. He ordered all tribute divided among the poor and the families of the martyrs of Hattin. When his treasurer protested that the royal vault was nearly empty, the Sultan replied, "Better an empty chest than a full conscience." His humility confused enemies and inspired allies. Even Crusader envoys began calling him the noble Sultan. And though Europe seethed with calls for revenge, Richard the Lionheart himself would later say, "Among infidels, I have found one man of God." As the year ended, Saladin stood once more on the Mount of Olives. Below him, Jerusalem gleamed in the soft winter light. The muezzin's call mingled with distant church bells. He turned to his son and said, "My child, remember this day. Kingdoms are dust, only justice endures." Then he mounted his horse and rode away without ceremony. Behind him, the holy city breathed again, scarred but alive. History would call it the greatest act of mercy in an age of wrath. And in that mercy lay Saladin's immortality. When news of Jerusalem's fall reached Europe, it struck like a thunderclap. In Rome, church bells rang in mourning. In Paris, men wept openly in the streets. In London, sermons spoke of divine punishment and disgrace. Pope Gregory VIII, trembling with anger and grief, issued a bull called Audita Tremendi. The trembling of the hearing, its words echoed through every cathedral. Let all who wear the cross gird themselves for the rescue of the sepulchre of the Lord. Across the continent, the call was heard, not by peasants and zealots as before, but by kings. 3 monarchs answered: Frederick Barbarossa of the Holy Roman Empire, Philip II, Augustus of France, and Richard III of England, soon to be called the Lionheart. Europe would march again. The Third Crusade had begun. The first to move was Frederick Barbarossa, an old warrior whose beard was said to be as red as the fires of battle. In 1189, at the age of nearly 70, he led an army of 100,000 Germans through the Balkans and into Anatolia. For months they marched, through blizzards, over mountains, across rivers that swallowed men whole. Turkish archers harassed them day and night, yet Barbarossa pressed onward, driven by faith and pride. Then, in the summer of 1190, tragedy struck. While crossing the river Goksu in Cilicia, the emperor's horse slipped. He fell into the torrent and drowned before his men could save him. The mightiest army of the Crusade dissolved in grief. Many returned home. Others died of hunger on the road. The old emperor's death was seen as an omen. Even kings could drown before reaching the Holy Land. When word reached Saladin in Damascus, he bowed his head. "The sea takes whom it wills," he said. "God's decree spares no one." While the Germans faltered, the French and English prepared their fleets. Philip II set sail from Marseille, and Richard from the English port of Messina, each commanding thousands of soldiers and ships. But before they arrived, the war in the East had already reignited. In 1189, the remnant of the Crusader kingdom, led by Guy of Lusignan, recently freed by Saladin, gathered at Acre, a fortress on the Mediterranean coast. Desperate to reclaim his throne, Guy laid siege to the city, which was held by a Muslim garrison, loyal to Saladin. Soon the hills around Acre became a nightmare of mud, corpses, and disease. Saladin surrounded the Crusaders in turn, trapping them between his army and the city walls. For nearly 2 years, both sides suffered unspeakable losses. The siege became a monstrous stalemate, a ring of death where hunger, not swords, was the greater killer. From his camp outside Acre, Saladin directed both the city's defense and the containment of the besiegers. He rode daily among his soldiers, visiting the sick, sending food to starving villagers, and praying through the night. One chronicler wrote, "He was everywhere, in the saddle, in the tent, in the mosque." But even the Sultan's endurance had limits. His commanders urged him to abandon Acre and retreat inland. Saladin refused. "If Acre falls," he said, "the sea will bring them forever." He understood the deeper meaning of the siege. Acre was not just a fortress. It was the gate to Jerusalem. Whoever held it would command the coast and the world's attention. In England, Richard II was preparing for the greatest journey of his life. Crowned in 1189, he was barely 31, tall, broad-shouldered, and consumed by 2 passions, war and glory. He spoke little English but fluent French, Latin, and the language of battle. He sold castles, titles, and even public offices to fund his crusade. "I would sell London itself," he said, "if I could find a buyer." By summer 1190, his fleet, more than 200 ships, left the ports of England. Storms scattered them across the Mediterranean. When Richard stopped in Messina, Sicily, he quarreled with its king, plundered the city, and forced peace on his own terms. To the Crusaders, he seemed invincible. To his enemies, unpredictable. Then, in 1191, his fleet left Sicily and sailed toward the coast of Palestine, to Acre, where the greatest siege of the century awaited him. The sight of the Western fleet stunned both friend and foe. From the decks gleamed hundreds of banners, lions, crosses, and eagles flashing in the sun. The people in the Crusader camp fell to their knees, believing salvation had arrived. Richard's ships anchored beside those of Philip II of France, who had reached Acre days earlier. Though allies by vow, the 2 kings mistrusted each other. Richard was bold and theatrical, Philip cold and calculating. They greeted like brothers and eyed each other like rivals. Saladin, watching from the hills, understood that the game had changed. "Now," he said, "we fight not princes, but kings." With the arrival of the royal armies, the siege turned apocalyptic. Richard's engineers constructed massive trebuchets, which he named God's Stone Thrower and Bad Neighbor. Their stones crashed through Acre's walls day and night. From within, Saladin's garrison fought desperately, signaling for help with fire beacons. The Sultan launched assault after assault on the besieging camp, hoping to break their circle. But the Crusaders' fortifications held. The battlefield became a cemetery. Thousands of corpses lay between the walls and the sea. Disease swept through both camps, dysentery, fever, and rot. Men drank brackish water and died choking on sand, yet still they fought. Acre became a place where faith and madness were the same thing. Richard's presence transformed the Crusader army he led from the front, wading into battle in gleaming armor, his lion emblazoned shield flashing in the sun. When arrows struck his helmet, he laughed and charged again. Chroniclers called him the thunder of the battlefield. One Muslim historian wrote, "When the Frankish king fought, it was as if Satan himself rode before his men." But courage alone could not end the siege. As the weeks dragged on, Richard fell ill with fever. Even from his bed, he ordered catapults built and strategies revised. "If I cannot stand," he said, "then I will command lying down." By contrast, Saladin remained composed and methodical. He sent nightly messages to the garrison, promising relief. He even offered the Crusaders terms, safe departure in exchange for peace. Richard refused. Pride had replaced patience on both sides. After nearly 2 years of siege, on July 12, 1191, Acre finally surrendered. The Muslim defenders, starving and outnumbered, negotiated terms with Richard and Philip. They would hand over the city in exchange for the lives of their soldiers and the promise of ransom. Saladin agreed to pay the ransom, 200,000 gold dinars, and to return the relic of the true cross. But weeks passed, and the payments could not be arranged quickly enough. Richard grew suspicious, fearing delay or deceit. Then came the darkest day of his crusade. On August 20th, 1191, Richard ordered 2,700 Muslim prisoners executed outside Acre's walls, men, women, and children, in full view of Saladin's camp. When Saladin saw the slaughter, he turned away in silence. His officers waited for orders of vengeance. None came. He said quietly, "It is not for me to copy cruelty. God will judge the deed and the doer." The moral chasm between the two kings was laid bare. Acre was now a ruin. Its streets, once filled with merchants and pilgrims, reeked of decay. The Crusaders raised their banners over the towers, but victory felt hollow. Even among them, whispers spread that God had turned away from such blood. Richard and Philip quarreled bitterly over the spoils. The French king, sick and disillusioned, announced his return to Europe. "I came for salvation," he said, "and found only bones." He sailed home, leaving Richard alone to carry the cross. The English king, undeterred, gathered his men and marched south toward Jaffa, the next step toward Jerusalem. Saladin withdrew inland, reorganizing his armies, aware that his truest battle had yet to begin. In defeat, Saladin showed more control than Richard did in victory. He strengthened garrisons along the coast, replenished the cavalry, and ordered new wells dug in the plains of Ramla. "Let them come thirsty," he said, "and the desert will fight for us." He wrote letters to Muslim rulers from Yemen to Mosul, urging unity. "If we stand apart," he warned, "the cross will cut us one by one." His composure inspired his men. Even after the loss of Acre, no city revolted, no soldier deserted. The Sultan's faith was their fortress. Every night he prayed, "O Lord, grant me victory, not for myself, but for the truth you revealed." Richard's army, though triumphant, was plagued by exhaustion. The heat was relentless. The stench of death followed them. Yet the Lionheart drove them forward, determined to retake Jerusalem. As they marched along the coast, Saladin's horsemen shadowed them constantly, striking supply lines, ambushing scouts, vanishing into dunes. Neither side could deliver a final blow. For every hill conquered by day, the desert reclaimed it by night. The two greatest commanders of their age now played a deadly game of endurance. The world held its breath to see which would break first, the Sultan's patience or the lion's pride. In Acre's aftermath, chroniclers recorded two contrasting kings. Richard prayed with clenched fists demanding victory. Saladin prayed with open hands asking only for wisdom. The Lionheart's strength was his courage, his weakness, his temper. Saladin's strength was his restraint, his weakness, his compassion. And yet, destiny would bind them together, not as friends but as mirrors. In each, the other would see what his own soul lacked. By the end of 1191, the Holy Land was split once more. The coastal cities under Crusader control, the inland plains under the Sultans. The Third Crusade had begun as a quest for redemption, but now it had become a test of endurance between two men. Europe hailed Richard as the new Charlemagne. The East revered Saladin as a second caliph, but both understood what the crowds did not. Glory fades faster than peace endures. From his tent overlooking the sea, Richard wrote to his mother, Queen Eleanor, "I have taken Acre, but I have not taken Jerusalem." And far away in Damascus, Saladin whispered in his nightly prayer, "He will come, and I will meet him, not as enemy, but as test." The true confrontation, the meeting of the lion and the falcon, was still to come. As winter fell on the Holy Land, two camps faced each other across the dust, one marked by the cross, the other by the crescent. Between them lay the roads to Jaffa and to Jerusalem, strewn with bones, banners, and broken pride. The Third Crusade had truly begun, not as a march of faith, but as a war of endurance, will, and souls. And on both sides the same prayer rose into the desert night, "God, let truth prevail." The Lionheart sharpened his sword. The Sultan bowed in prayer. The final act of this holy war was about to unfold. By the autumn of 1191, the Holy Land was split in two colors, the gold of the desert and the blue of the sea. Between them moved two men whose names would outlive empires, Richard the Lionheart and Salah al-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub. The storm of Acre had passed. Now the world held its breath for their first true clash. The Lionheart marched south with 12,000 knights and infantry, their cross-emblazoned banners gleaming in the sun. The Sultan watched from the hills, his cavalry shadowing every move like hawks circling their prey. Both understood that whoever held the coastal road would decide the fate of Jerusalem. For Richard, victory meant redemption. For Saladin, survival meant faith itself. Richard's army moved with discipline rare for the Crusades. He insisted that every man walk in formation, knights nearest the enemy, archers beside the shore, supply trains protected in the center. When heat beat down like hammer blows, he marched on foot to encourage his soldiers. Saladin's horsemen harassed the rear daily, raining arrows and then vanishing into dust. The Crusaders endured thirst, fever, and constant fear of ambush. Yet Richard never allowed panic. He commanded retaliation only when sure of advantage. "Let the desert strike first," he told his men, "then we strike back like the sea." Saladin watched this discipline with reluctant admiration. "These Franks have found a king," he said, "and a king who knows order is a dangerous thing." Near the coastal village of Arsuf, north of Jaffa, the Sultan saw his chance. The Crusaders were weary, hemmed between forest and sea. If he could break their line here, Jerusalem would never be threatened again. At dawn on September 7, 1191, the Muslim trumpet sounded. Thousands of archers and cavalry swept down from the hills like a black wave. Arrows filled the air, drums rolled, and the Crusader rear ranks buckled. Richard rode at the center, calm as stone. He gave no order to charge, though his knights cried for permission. He waited until the enemy was closest, until discipline felt like madness. Then he raised his sword. Now! The whole Christian line pivoted and charged. Iron met flesh with earth-shaking impact. Saladin's front ranks reeled back under the lances. He immediately ordered a counterstrike on the flanks, turning the battle into a maelstrom of dust and shouting. By sunset, both armies were exhausted. Richard held the field, but Saladin's core force was intact. Neither claimed victory. Each had tested the other and found an equal. That night, the Sultan said to his brother, "His courage is a flame. It burns bright, but it will consume him." And Richard, hearing that Saladin had withdrawn without chaos, remarked, "He fights like a king and rules like a saint." Arsuf was a stalemate disguised as triumph. Richard continued to Jaffa, his troops bloodied but inspired. Saladin fell back toward Ramla, preserving his cavalry and morale. Both needed rest, but neither could stop. The Sultan ordered fortifications rebuilt around Jerusalem. He stationed elite archers at every approach and gathered fresh supplies in the hills of Hebron. He knew Richard would come, and he wanted the city to withstand a year if necessary. Meanwhile, Richard secured the coastal ports one by one: Caesarea, Arsuf, and finally Jaffa. He repaired its harbor and made it his base of operations. The sea was his lifeline, the only thing connecting him to Europe. By winter of 1191, the cross was once again within sight of Jerusalem's walls. The Crusader army camped in the hills of Ramla and Beth Nuba, close enough to see the holy city glistening on clear days. Richard rode ahead to survey the terrain. He looked upon the golden domes from a distance, then turned to his commanders. "If we take it," he said, "can we hold it?" No one answered. The winter rains turned roads into mud. Supplies dwindled, the men grew sick and restless. When Saladin's raiders burned the grain fields, Richard recognized the truth. A city conquered without support would be a city lost again. He ordered a retreat to the coast. Some wept, others cursed him for cowardice. But history would judge him wise. Jerusalem was safe, for now. Saladin did not celebrate. He knew the crusade was not over. He expected a second offensive in spring and prepared accordingly. He rebuilt forts at Ascalon and Gaza, stationed his brother Al-Adil to guard the southern road, and gathered scouts along the Jordan. Despite constant pressure, he refused to demonize his enemy. When Christian envoys arrived to negotiate the exchange of prisoners, he welcomed them with hospitality and sent fruit and ice to their fevered king. To his court, he said, "Kindness to the enemy is not betrayal. It is a test of faith." Early in 1192, Richard fell gravely ill with a desert fever. For days he lay in his tent near Ascalon, raving between prayer and hallucination. When Saladin heard of it, he sent his personal physician and baskets of fresh fruit, cooled with snow, from Lebanon. The gesture astonished both armies. Richard's chaplain recorded, "The enemy treated our king better than our own." Upon recovering, Richard raised a cup of water and said, "If honor is a faith, then Saladin is a believer." From that moment, a strange bond grew. Two foes who respected each other more than their allies. By summer, negotiations had stalled. Saladin decided to strike first and retake Jaffa, the key to the coast. In July 1192, His army swept out of the hills and overran the city in a single day. Crusader survivors fled to the citadel and barred the gates. When news reached Richard aboard his ship at Acre, he acted instantly. Ignoring advisors who begged him to wait for reinforcements, he manned his galleys with a handful of knights and sailed straight for Jaffa. At dawn, his fleet appeared on the horizon. The Muslim army, relaxing after victory, stared in shock as English warriors leapt from ships into waist-deep water, charging straight from the sea. The counter-attack was furious. Saladin's troops were pushed back into the streets. Richard fought bareheaded, his armor drenched in blood and sweat, his sword shattered and replaced 3 times. When the Sultan heard that the city was lost, he sighed, "Then God has willed another trial for us." He ordered no pursuit. Instead, he sent an envoy to Richard that evening, offering fresh fruit and a truce. The two leaders never met face to face, yet their messages revealed mutual esteem rare in war. Saladin wrote, "Your valor is beyond measure. May God guide us both to what is just." Richard replied, "Your honor is your kingdom. If we meet in peace, I would gladly call you brother." Chroniclers on both sides told tales of this unseen duel, a battle not of blades but of character. Each sought to outdo the other in chivalry, as if moral victory were the true prize. By August 1192, both armies were exhausted. The heat was unbearable, supplies low and disease rampant. Neither side could sustain the war. Envoys traveled between Jaffa and Jerusalem, carrying proposals and promises. Each time, Saladin added one condition: that pilgrims of all faiths might enter the holy city without fear. At last, on September 2nd, 1192, the two kings sealed the Treaty of Jaffa. The Crusaders would retain a narrow coastal strip from Acre to Jaffa. Jerusalem would remain under Muslim rule. Christian pilgrims could visit its shrines in safety. When the treaty was read aloud, Richard smiled, weary but content. Saladin bowed his head and whispered, "Praise be to God who makes peace where men make war." Before Richard departed, he sent one final message, a request to meet the Sultan in person. Saladin declined politely. Two swords cannot rest in one scabbard, but their edges need not be enemies. He sent instead a gift, a fine Arab horse and a ring set with green jade. Richard accepted and sent his own token in return, a suit of crimson armor for Saladin's brother Aladil. When the Crusader fleet sailed from Jaffa, the Muslim army stood on the shore watching in silence. There was no jeering, no curses, only mutual exhaustion and respect. As Richard's ship disappeared over the horizon, Saladin said softly, "If he returns, may it be as a friend." The truce held. For the next few years, pilgrims from Europe walked openly to Jerusalem under Muslim protection. Markets flourished again along the coast. Merchants from Venice and Damascus shared the same harbors. Saladin returned to Damascus, greeted as a hero, but he claimed no triumph. To end a war without hatred, he said, that is the greater victory. Richard never saw the Holy Land again. He died 7 years later in France, his heart buried apart from his body, a symbol of a king who had fought for heaven but never reached it. In the spring of 1193, Saladin fell ill after years of unceasing labor. When doctors warned him of his end, he smiled. "Praise God," he said, "who gives life as loan and takes it as gift." He called his sons and ordered his wealth distributed to the poor. When his treasurer counted, they found only 1 gold coin. Everything else had been given away. He asked that at his funeral a piece of white cloth be carried before his coffin, and a herald cry out, "This is all that Saladin, conqueror of kings and worlds, takes to the grave nothing. He was buried in a simple tomb in Damascus. No marble, no crown, only a name carved in quiet letters. Salah al-Din, servant of God. In the centuries that followed, poets and chroniclers on both sides retold the story of these two men, the lion and the falcon, the cross and the crescent. They found in their rivalry a mirror of humanity itself, ambition and restraint, courage and mercy, pride and faith. Even European knights adopted the Sultan's name as a symbol of honor. In England, children grew up hearing that Saladin kept his word better than kings. In the East, Richard was remembered as the brave enemy, a man whose valor elevated his opponent's virtue. Their duel ended the age of crusading zeal and began the era of respect between civilizations. The battlefield of Arsuf is silent now. The waves wash the sand where once the two greatest armies of their time collided. The stones of Jaffa gleam under the same sun that saw their swords flash. And in Jerusalem, the call to prayer still echoes beside the church bells. History remembers kings for what they conquered. It remembers Saladin and Richard for what they chose not to destroy. Their war ended without a victor, yet both won immortality. For in their clash, the world glimpsed something rare, the moment when faith outshone fanaticism, and when enemies looked at each other and saw men instead of monsters. Honor, said Saladin, is the bridge between heaven and earth, and across that bridge, even two kings who never met walked side by side into legend. When the banners of England vanished beyond the horizon in 1192, silence fell over the Holy Land. For nearly a century, trumpets and prayers had mixed with screams. Now only the sea spoke, rolling softly against the beaches of Jaffa. Saladin disbanded most of his army and rode back toward Damascus. The long road smelled of dust and olive wood. Every village he passed lit lamps to honor him, yet he refused celebration. Victory, he said, is not the end of war. Peace is. The Treaty of Jaffa had closed the Third Crusade, leaving the coast to the Franks and Jerusalem, to the Muslims. But beneath the parchment, exhaustion ruled both empires. The people of the East buried their dead. The people of the West counted their debts. The agreement was simple and astonishing. For the first time in the century of conflict, pilgrims of every faith, Muslim, Christian, and Jew, were promised safe passage to the holy city. No fortresses would rise within 10 miles of Jerusalem. Markets between Acre and Jaffa would reopen under joint guard. To seal it, Saladin swore by the Quran and Richard by the Gospel. Their envoys embraced. Soldiers on both sides laid down arms for the first time since childhood. Chroniclers called it the peace of hearts. For merchants it meant trade. For mothers, the return of sons. For priests, the sound of bells instead of arrows. Even the muezzin on the walls of Jerusalem paused to listen to the silence. Richard prepared to sail home in the spring of 1193. Before leaving, he sent one final message to Saladin. You are the mirror in which I have seen my own soul. The Sultan replied, if the sea were land, I would come to shake your hand. Their ships never crossed again, yet their respect became legend. Richard left the Holy Land without touching Jerusalem, a decision that haunted him, yet saved thousands. He'd come to reclaim the city of God and left, having found the humanity of his enemy. Damascus welcomed Saladin with triumphal arches, but he entered quietly through a side gate. He refused the title Conqueror of Jerusalem and ordered the treasury open for the poor. Witnesses wrote that he spent his evenings in study, not in feasts. He met scholars, freed prisoners, and planned schools and hospitals funded from his own estate. He said, "The sword built nothing lasting, only knowledge keeps its edge." Under his rule, caravans moved safely from Cairo to Mosul. Christian merchants traded in Muslim bazaars without fear. For the first time in generations, the crescent and the cross shared the same road. That winter, fever struck Damascus. Saladin tended the sick himself until he collapsed with exhaustion. His doctors begged him to rest. He answered, "How shall I rest when so many suffer?" On March 3rd, 1193, he knew the end had come. He gave away all remaining gold, a single coin, and ordered his shroud woven from a plain cotton. At dawn, he whispered to his son, "Do justice, love mercy, and remember that power ends." He died with the Quran in his hands and a smile of relief. The city mourned for 40 days. From Cairo to Baghdad, mosques echoed with his name. Even in Europe, her churches rang their bells for the noble infidel. Saladin was buried near the great mosque of Damascus. No marble walls, no royal guards, only 2 tombstones, one of stone, one of wood. A verse was carved, "Every soul shall taste death." Centuries later, Emperor Kaiser Wilhelm II visited the tomb and placed a silver casket beside it, saying, "Europe still honors the Knight of the East." Even today, pilgrims of all faiths visit that quiet chamber. They do not ask for miracles. They come to remember restraint. The Fourth Crusade, a crusade without honor. After Saladin's death, his sons divided the empire. Unity faded, ambition returned. In Europe, Pope Innocent III called for another crusade, the fourth, to reclaim what was lost. But greed corrupted zeal. Instead of sailing to Jerusalem, the Crusaders turned their weapons on fellow Christians, sacking Constantinople in 1204. Churches burned, icons melted, and relics sold for silver. The Holy War had become a business. What began at Clermont as faith now ended in plunder. Historians would call it the Crusade that crucified Christ again. In 1212, rumors spread of miracle children marching to free the Holy Land without swords. Thousands of boys and girls wandered from France and Germany, singing psalms and carrying crosses. Few reached the sea. Most perished of hunger or were sold into slavery. Europe began to see that God no longer marched behind its banners. The era of the holy wars was dying, not by defeat, but by disbelief. 2 more crusades followed, led by kings who sought fame rather than faith. None reached Jerusalem. The Muslims, fractured yet vigilant, held the city through diplomacy as much as arms. In 1291, the last Crusader stronghold, Acre, fell to the Mamluks. When its towers burned, the age of the Crusades ended. 200 years of blood had achieved nothing eternal, except lessons written in sand. From those wars rose universities, hospitals, new trade routes, and a slow understanding that East and West were neighbors, not strangers. Europe learned algebra, medicine, and paper from the Muslims it had once tried to destroy. The East adopted fortification design, coinage, and new forms of law from the West. Through tragedy, knowledge traveled where armies could not. It was the only crusade that ever succeeded. Ballads in England sang of Richard's valor. Poets in Damascus wrote of Saladin's mercy. Both names became metaphors, one for courage, the other for conscience. In the 13th century, Dante Alighieri placed Saladin in the Divine Comedy among righteous souls, not in hell. And in Muslim chronicles, Richard was praised as the lion who kept his word. Their story endured because it defied hatred. They proved that even enemies can be noble. and that the truest victory is moral, not military. By the 1300s, crusading fervor had cooled. Kings turned to commerce, scholars to science, and pilgrims to peaceful prayer. The world had grown tired of holy blood, yet the echo of those centuries never faded. Borders drawn in that age still shape nations today, and in the dust of Jerusalem the bones of Crusader and Saracen lie side by side, indistinguishable in death. The lesson of history does not repeat, it remembers. The Crusades began with fear and ended with understanding. Each battle, each betrayal, each act of mercy carved a path from fanaticism to faith. When people today walk through the old city, they pass churches rebuilt by Muslims, mosques repaired by Christians, and walls restored by both. Jerusalem remains what it was always meant to be, a mirror of the human heart, divided, yet longing to be whole. Centuries later, a traveler from Europe stood before the dome of the rock. He removed his shoes and entered quietly, watching light pour through the windows. A Muslim guardian saw the cross around his neck and said only, "Peace be upon you." The pilgrim wept and replied, "And upon you peace." In that brief exchange, 8 centuries of war found their answer. Faith had returned to what it was before armies claimed it, a whisper between souls, not a shout over corpses. On Saladin's tomb are carved the words, "From Allah we come, to Him we return." On Richard's heart, buried apart from his body, the inscription reads, "Here lies the heart of a lion. 2 men, 2 faiths, 1 lesson. Power dies, character endures. The Crusades began with swords. They ended with a hand extended in respect. And so, as the sun sets on the blood-stained centuries, the story of the Crusades closes not in hatred but in humility. For every Jerusalem lost or won, the narrator says, there remains a Jerusalem within us, a city we must learn to defend, not with armies, but with understanding. After seeing how Saladin's leadership shaped the Crusades, we'd love to hear your thoughts. Do you think his blend of military strategy and mercy was a key factor in his success? Or do you believe his compassion was a strategic mistake in a time of war? What do you think? Could Saladin's approach to leadership and mercy be applied in modern times? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. We want to hear what you think. If you enjoyed this deep dive into history, hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on the bell to stay updated with our future videos as we uncover more captivating historical moments.